So as a next step in our little application, which is slowly taking shape here, let's work on the places. We are able to view our users, and when we click a user, I want to view all the places that belong to that user. And right now, that is just not happening. I can click the user, and I, in the end, just reload this page over and over again. The reason for that simply is that we haven't set up any route here in app.js that would handle the case that we want to view the places of a user. Now, for that, we first of all should create a new page, a places page, which is responsible for showing all the places of a user. So in the pages folder, in the places folder, I'll add a user places.js file. And in there, I want to have a component which, well, fetches and renders all the places that belong to a user. Now, the fetching part will only happen later once we also have a backend to connect the app to. But for now here, we'll also work with some dummy data. So let's import React from React here and create our user places component as we did multiple times before in this course. And of course, export this component here like that. And now I want to return my list of places. Now that list of places will actually be outsourced in a separate component. You don't have to do that, but again, I want to keep my page component lean. I want to keep every component lean and therefore split my app into smaller pieces. For that, we can add a place list.js file in the components folder, in the places folder, for example, and add a place list CSS file there so that some styling can also be added. And also maybe add a place item.js and a place item CSS file so that we can split this up even more, and just as we did it with the user, manage list and item separated from each other. So in place list.js, there I want to import React from React again and create my place list component where we will receive some props to configure what we output. And in the end, of course, I export place list. And we can also add the CSS import to /place list CSS. We can copy all that content into place item because in the end, this file here will look very similar, just that we're talking about the place item component, and hence we should adjust the CSS import and also the names down there. Now back to place list. In there, the idea is, surprisingly, to output a list of places. Well, at least if we have places. So similar to what we did in our users list component, and therefore we might be able to merge some logic, but I'm not sure. I will leave it separated here also to make it clearer and easier to follow. So similar to that other component though, I will first of all check if my items prop, which I expect to get, which should be an array of places, if the length of that is equal to 0, which means I have no places. In that case, I want to return a card in the end where I say no places found. So I'll return a div here, first of all, with a class name of place-list and then center as an extra class. So 2 classes added to that div. And then I want to add my card. So I'll import the card component from the shared folder components UI elements card. And then in that div, render that card like that. And in there, add a h2 tag where I say no places found. Maybe create one. And then also below that, a button which says share place, or actually that should be a link later, which leads to the new place page. So I could import the link here from React Router DOM, but actually we'll soon create a custom button, which can be either a button or a link, and therefore for now I'll just leave that button placeholder, which for the moment won't do anything. So that's our fallback if we have no places. Then we return this content. Now, of course, hopefully we do have some places, so let's also handle that scenario. In that scenario, I want to render an unordered list with a class of place list added to it. And in there, similar to what we had in the users list, I want to loop, or I want to go through all my items and map this array of vanilla JavaScript objects, which we'll have there, to an array of JSX elements. So we can output something dynamic here with curly braces, and then props items map is the way to go. This allows us to go through every place we have and then render a place item for every place. Now for that, let's import the place item component. Import place item from the sibling place item file, which is in the same folder. And now we can pass data to place item. For one, we need to set that special key property React requires. It always requires that when you're rendering sibling items that have the same type, so put in other words, if you're outputting a list of JSX elements. Then here I want to have a key of place ID and also an ID, which I want to forward. Also place ID. Then I want to forward an image because every place should have an image. So I will forward place dot, let's say, image URL. Of course, it's up to you which data you expect here. You just have to make sure that when you later create and fetch the data, it has the structure you are expecting here. So I'm expecting that a place has an image URL property and an ID. I also want to have a title on my place, so I will forward place.title. I also want to have a short description, so I will forward place.description. And also an address, a human readable address, which should be place.address. In addition, a place is created by a user, and that user has an ID, so I will forward place.creator to the creator ID prop. And the coordinates are also required. We have the address to show the human readable address, but I also need the coordinates to show this on a map because we're going to render a map as well. And there I want to have place.location as a property on the place that holds these coordinates. Coordinates will be an object with a lat for latitude and a lng for longitude property, but you'll see this in action later. With that, we added a bunch of data we feed into place item. For now, I think that does the trick. Now let's work on place item and let's make sure we do something with all the data there. Now, place item will become a bit more complex in the future, but for the moment, it can be very straightforward. I want to return a list item here. A list item that also gets a class, place item, and that now somehow needs to output all the information we get. For example, here, I want to output an image. For that, I'll add a div, and that div will also receive a class name of place-item __ image. And in there, we can add an image element and set the source to props.image because we will pass this image prop to place item, so we can reference it there. Alt can be set to props.title. Now below that div, I'll add another div with a class name of place-item __ info. And here, I want to have a h2 tag where I output the title, and a h3 tag where I output the address, and then let's say a paragraph where I output the description. Now, by the way, I will, of course, again provide some styling to you, so make sure you got all the class names and so on right, and you got the same HTML structure so that the styles work for you. Of course, you can deviate from my structure and setup, but then you'll have to adjust the styles on your own. Now, last but not least, I'll add one last div here to every list item, and that is a div that receives a CSS class as well, the place-item __ actions class. And in here, I want to have buttons that allow the user to interact with that place. The interactions here should be that you can view the place on a map. So that should open up an overlay which shows the place on a map, and we will of course add that functionality throughout this module. I want to have another button which allows us to edit this place. Later we will make sure that we only see this button if we are the creator of the place. For now it will always be shown. And the same for a delete button. Later it will only be shown if you did create the place. For the moment it's always shown. So we got these three buttons there. Now I want to wrap my place here in the end with the card component. So we'll import that card component, which we imported earlier from shared components, UI elements, card. And then inside of the list item, add the card surrounding all the divs, and to the card itself, I'll also add a class place-item __ content. With that, we have some code that should output places. Now it's time for some CSS. And therefore, as before, attached you find a place item CSS file, which holds all the CSS code you should put into the place item CSS file in your project. And you find a place list CSS file, which holds CSS code you should add to your place list CSS file. And with that, we hopefully have a setup here that works. Now back in user places, of course, we have to use our place list. So there I will import place list from, going up one level, components, place list. And then here, return the place list component as a self-closing component. But of course here, we have to pass in items on that items prop. And that should be an array of the places we want to display. For that, I will create a dummy array here, actually outside of this function, which I'll name dummy places to make it really clear that this is only a temporary placeholder. And in there, we can now add some places. Each place needs an ID, let's say P1, a title, let's say Empire State Building, a description, one of the most famous skyscrapers in the world, an image, and there we have to be careful. In place list, I extract image URL, so a place should have a property named image URL. So let's name it image URL here, where I will just pick an image from the web that shows the Empire State Building. Here we go. Then the human readable address, which I will simply fetch on Google Maps. There I searched for the Empire State Building, and this is then the address I want to use. And for the coordinates, which I also need, coordinates, I am extracting location, actually, should be the name. I'm extracting location here, so let's name this location. And that should be a nested object with a let and a LNG key. And both should be numbers, latitude and longitude, which is the default measurement system for coordinates. You get that from Google Maps as well. The thing here after the @ symbol, that's the latitude before the comma. So let's add it here. And then after this comma here, in my case, the -73 and so on, that is the longitude. And the minus is part of the longitude. So let's add that here. And with that, I have my dummy place here. Now I will actually just duplicate it, the exact same place, but with a different ID. And I also forgot that we need a creator field because we are also extracting the creator ID, which should be stored in a creator field. And there I will use U1 here. And for the other place, I will use U2. And these will be the IDs of the users who created the places. For now, as all the other things on this front end here, of course, that's just dummy data. So we have all of that added. Now we can feed our dummy places into the place list here. So let's do that, just like this, and save it. And now to see whether that works, we need a way of reaching user places. And to reach it, we need to adjust our routes, of course, because that is ultimately where we control which pages are loaded for which URL. So here in app.js, I will import the user places component from /places, pages, user places, and now add a new route. Add a new route where the path we're looking for actually has a dynamic segment. You signal that to the React router by adding a colon and then any identifier of your choice, UID or user ID, whatever you want. You will later be able to extract the actual value entered in the URL for this segment in the component which is loaded. This simply means you don't know the exact value yet, it is dynamic. Here it will be the user ID, and of course we will have many users, so this could be U1, U2, U3. Well, we just want to handle any user ID here. Now followed by places, so that we can reach this route if we enter our domain / some user ID / places. If that's the path we have, I want to reach user places here, this component. Now let's also add exact here as we did it on the other routes to make sure that only exactly this path loads this route. And now we should be able to reach user places. if we save that and we go back to our application and I click on the user, we are going to a page which has exactly this path. So if I click here, that looks good. Here are our user places. Now the buttons don't look awesome yet. We can definitely work on those, and we will. But other than that, this looks really, really neat. Now you see my places is highlighted here. This makes sense because at the moment in nav links, I set the link my places leads to /u1 places, which is exactly the link we're on right now, because we clicked on this user who has an ID of u1, and therefore, well, this is the URL we have. Now what we're not doing is we're not making sure that we only show the places that belong to that user. This is something we're not doing. And that will be the next step. In user places, we want to make sure that we filter out the places that don't have the ID of the user we have encoded in the URL, because we only want to see the places of the user with the ID u1, not all places. So this place with the ID of u2 for the creator, we don't want to show that. Let's fix that. Now to filter out places by ID, we need to find out which ID is encoded in the URL. And for that, we can use a tool React Router DOM offers to us. We import it from React Router DOM, and there we have a hook, the use params hook, which we can use in functional components. Like all hooks, they're only usable in functional components, but since I only work with functional components in this app, we can use them in every component. Now use params is simply executed as a function, and it gives us access to the parameters, as it's called, so to the dynamic segments React Router is aware of. Dynamic segments are these things you encode with a colon in your route configuration. So in this case, we can get the user ID. And use params will return an object which has your dynamic segments you set up in the route config as properties. So for the user places component, there will be an object with a user ID property, which then in turn holds the concrete value that's entered in the URL as a value. So here I can access user ID and store that in, let's say, the user ID constant. This gives us access to the user ID that's encoded in the URL. And with that, we can get our places. We could call it loaded places here by using our dummy places. And then we can use the built-in filter method to run a filter on every element in dummy places and have a look at every element and only keep it in the newly returned array. Filter will return a new array if the creator of that place we're looking at is equal to user ID. And then we want to forward loaded places here to place list. As a consequence, if I reload, we now only see one place here. If I visit U3, I see no places because we have no place for a user U3. And for U2, I also see one place. So this works, and we are now filtering this successfully. Now, why don't we work on the map next? However, before we do so, let's make sure the buttons look a bit more pretty. To get prettier buttons, I got something prepared for you. In the shared components folder, add a new subfolder, which you can name form elements. Here I want to store some components which are helpful with creating forms or with user interaction. And there, attached, you find a button zip file, which you can extract and which you can unzip. And in there, you find a button.js and a button CSS file, which you should move into this form elements file. Now let's have a brief look at what you get in there. You get a component, and in the button component, I render different things based on the props we receive. If we have a ref prop, I render a normal anchor ref, a normal link. If we have a to prop, I render a link as it's coming from React Router DOM. And I also give users the option of adding some special styles, for example, controlling the size of the button, inverse, danger. We'll use that throughout the course, no worries. There also are some default classes attached for some nice styling. And of course, I also render a normal button. If we have neither a to nor a ref prop, then we render a normal button where we can also control the type, forward our on-click listener, and even disable it. This is a button, and here we got some styles for that button so that it hopefully looks nice. Now with that, we can use this button in the place item component instead of the buttons I currently render there. So let's import this button component here, import button from shared components form elements button, and replace the buttons down there with the better button, with the custom button. Now the buttons can be configured, and for view and map, I want to add the inverse prop, which makes this look better in my opinion in this place here. For editing, I don't want to add any inverse prop, but I want to add the to prop because this should actually be a link which redirects the user to a page that allows us to do the editing. So here I will add a template literal and then forward to, let's say, places slash, and then here props.id, which is the ID of that place, so that this leads us to slash places slash place ID, which is a route we haven't registered yet, but which we will add later. And for deleting, I will add the danger prop, which colors this button red and more dangerous. And we will also soon add on click listeners to the first and the last button. With that, I think that looks a bit nicer. And we can now focus on making sure that when we click on view on map, we actually, open an overlay, let's say, where we highlight the position of this place on a map. To show the position of a place on a map, I will add two new components. One is a modal. A modal is an overlay, which you see on many websites. It's basically like a pop-up, but built into the page, not in a new browser window. It has a background where we can use this backdrop, which we already use for the side drawer on mobile. And then we have that modal as an overlay. In that modal, we can display anything. And indeed, I will build a reusable modal here, which we can use to host any kind of content, confirmation dialogues, whatever we need. In this case, a map. And that's then the second thing we need. We'll build a special version of that modal, which uses that modal, but then hosts a map inside of it. So let's start with the generic modal itself. For this, in UI elements here, next to card and so on, we can create a new file, the modal.js file, and also a modal CSS file because we will certainly need some styling. In modal.js, as always, we import React from React, and then we have our modal component here, which receives props, and which exports this modal then in the end. We also need to import our CSS file here, so import ./modal CSS. Now actually in here, I want to have a second component. No one is forcing you to only have one component per file. Typically that is what you have, but if you have two components that work closely together, then you can also absolutely have more than one component in a file. Please note that I will only export the modal here though. The second component, which I will build here, is only for internal use, so the modal component will use that second component I will also build. And that will be the actual modal overlay, so the thing we will actually see on the screen. This is another component I add here, which is not exported but will be used by modal. Now let's start with structuring the content of the modal overlay. I will use the React DOM create portal method there. So let's import React DOM from React DOM. And then here I will return React DOM create portal and output some content here in a special place. There I will use document get element by ID modal-hook, which is a place we should add in the public index.html file. Maybe here between backdrop hook and drawer hook. That's our modal hook. That's the place where the modal will then be mounted to in the real DOM. So in the modal component, we now need to specify the content, which should actually be rendered there. Now the content here is a div with a class name of modal. Now actually, it's more than that. I want to be flexible here, so I will render a template literal here so that I can add my modal class, but I can also inject some other class name, and that's props.className. So that in the end, when we use the modal, we could also add our own classes to the modal, and we're not restricted to the classes set up here. Just a little extra flexibility. I will also add a style prop and set this to props.style, so that we could also directly add inline styles to this modal if we wanted to. Then I want to have a header in there. So basically a header, a title shown at the top of the modal. This header will also receive a class name. And here again, I want to be really flexible. So we'll add modal underscore underscore header, but then also add props.header class so that we can add our own header classes if we want to. In the header, the idea is to have a h2 tag where we output some text that is received on a props header property. Now that's the header. Below the header, but still inside the div, I will add a form. We'll not always need that, but if we had some modal content that should be part of a form, wrapping everything with a form here can be an advantage. Now you could also certainly build this in other ways, but here I want to have a really flexible modal, so I want to give the developer who will then use the modal, which of course is us, the possibility to add content that is automatically wrapped in a form. Not a must do, but something I want to do here. Here I will add an onSubmit handler and check if props onSubmit is set. And if it is set, I will call props onSubmit. So we'll bind onSubmit to the onSubmit I get through props. And otherwise, I will pass an inline function here where we get the event and where I call event prevent default. Why? Because I want to make sure that if we render any buttons inside of that form, we don't accidentally reload the page by triggering our form submission here. If we do provide our own submit function, then it's the duty of that submit function to prevent the default. Now inside of that form, I'll add another div. Class name here, again, is a dynamic binding to be really flexible. And there I will bind this to modal underscore underscore content, and then props.content class. So similar to the header, the idea simply is that if we use the modal in some place of our app, we can dynamically provide our custom header class to adjust the default look, our custom extra class for the content, and I'll do the same then later for the footer of the modal, which we'll also add. Inside of this content, I'll output props children, so whatever we add between the opening and closing tag of the modal. And then last but not least, I'll add a footer, still inside of the form, and here in that footer, or on that footer, just as before, dynamic classes are added. And here I will have modal underscore underscore footer as a class, but then for extra flexibility, add props.footer class to allow external customization. Now that's, by the way, also the reason now why I have that form here. In that footer, the user should be able to inject footer content, for example, buttons that allow the user to confirm a choice or something like that. And that would be hard to do if we only injected everything in the content here. Now, by the way, that split into a content div and the footer is the reason for this default form here. If the user wants to render a modal that holds a form, of course you could inject the form here as a content with props children. But if you want to have a nice styling where the submit buttons are visually separated from the content, which is the styling that will be applied by default with the default classes I add here, then this would not be possible to be all in one form, because the form would live here and the buttons would live here and they would not be inside of the form. That's why I have this wrapping general form here, which wraps both the content div as well as the footer, where the user can then inject, for example, the inputs of a form and then the submit buttons. And if you're not using a form and you're not providing onSubmit, it's ignored anyways. So that's the general structure of the modal overlay. Now, why do I have a separate component down there? Because a modal is more than just the overlay. A modal also needs a backdrop, and I also want to play a little animation when we open and close the modal. So therefore, we need to import two more things. We need to import the backdrop from /backdrop here, and import CSS transition from React transition group, that animation library we already used earlier. With that, in our modal component, not in modal overlay, but in modal, I want to return a React fragment because I'll have some sibling top-level elements. And I want to check if we have a show prop, which is trueish, in which case I will render the backdrop. And on the backdrop, we can click. And I want to trigger a onCancel method or function, which I receive on the onCancel prop here, if that is the case. So that outside of the modal, in the component where we use it, we can handle the cancellation and close it or do whatever we want to do. Now, besides rendering the backdrop, I also want to render the CSS transition here. And the in prop here is bound to props.show, which is our trigger for the backdrop as well. I set mount on enter and unmount on exit, add a timeout of 200 milliseconds, and then class names, not class name, but class names, and set this to modal. Now, the appropriate class names which this CSS transition component then will use will be added in modal CSS. And speaking of that, attached you find a modal CSS file, and you can simply put the content you find in there into your modal CSS file. Now make sure you're importing modal CSS and you're almost done. I'm saying almost because the key part is missing. The modal overlay, we're not using that in our modal down there. Of course, that is what I want to render between my CSS transition components though. So here we can add modal overlay and close it. And now do one thing. We forward all the props we get from outside to modal overlay. This syntax might look strange, but what it does is it takes the props we pass to modal, which is the component we export, and forwards them to modal overlay, which is the internal component which we don't export. This allows us to set, for example, footer class, content class, header, and so on the exported modal component, where we of course don't need it, we don't use it here, but we then forward it to modal overlay. So it allows us to set props on this internal component from outside, so to say. And this syntax might look strange, but this is the spread operator, which takes all the key value pairs of the props object and spreads them as attributes, so to say, onto modal overlay. And with that, we created a general modal. Now that general modal is nice, but of course we want a modal with a map. Now we'll work on the map soon, but for now let's show the normal modal. For that we can go to the place item where we have this view on map button. And now we need to manage some state, which we change when that button is pressed to show the modal, and then also when the backdrop of the modal is pressed to hide the modal. So I will import, use state from React here, and add a new state in place item, show map and set show map, which initially is false, because initially I don't want to show the modal. And then I will add functions here, the open map handler. There I simply call set show map and set this to true. And the close map handler, and you can guess what I'll do there, I'll set this to false. Now we also need to import the modal we just built. So import modal from our shared components, UI elements, the modal file there. And now use that. Now how do we use it? I want to render it next to my list item, and keep in mind it won't really be rendered there. Instead, because I use a portal, both on the backdrop as well as the modal overlay, it will be injected in a different place of our index.html file. And that's the nice thing about portals, which I already touched on earlier. They allow us to use a component in a certain place, in this case in the place item, and yet render the content of that component in a different place, which semantically might be better than attaching the modal markup next to the list item. We might be able to achieve the same look, but for screen readers and so on, and for semantics in general, that would not be ideal. So that's where a portal can help us. Now to have multiple sibling root items, we need React fragment. So we can wrap the list item with that. And then with React fragment as a new top level element in this component, we can render our modal here next to the list item. Now on this modal, I want to set the show prop and set this equal to show map, so to this state we just added. I also have an onCancel handler here, which, just to make this clear again, is in the end a function that will be triggered when we click the backdrop. That's when I, in the end, forward that click event to onCancel and trigger the function that's passed through onCancel. So onCancel will therefore point at the close map handler function, so that this function is executed when we click the backdrop. I will provide text for the header, and there I simply want to use the address, the human readable address of the place. And add an extra content class, which should be place-item __ modal-content. Let me reformat that to make it easier to read. And also add a footer class to that modal, which I'll set to place-item __ modal-actions. Now last but not least, I'll set the footer prop itself to a dynamic value, which will be some JSX, because there I want to have a button which allows me to close the modal. And therefore I'll add the onClick listener to the button and set this equal to the close map handler, just as on cancel. This button component here, through the footer prop, will be rendered in our modal overlay in this place at the end. That's where I use the footer prop. And since I forward all props I pass to modal overlay, if I pass anything in a footer prop, this is where it will end up. So with that, I prepared the modal, but the main content is missing. Between the opening and closing tag of the modal, we have to specify what should be rendered in the place of props children. Because remember, props children is that special prop React knows, which renders whatever is between the opening and closing tag of your React, of your JSX element. So here in the modal, there I want to render my map. For now, I will render a div here with a class name of map container. And I will actually add this class in place item CSS, maybe here above the media query. Map container can be a simple class where you set a height of, let's say, 20 rem and a width of 100%. So make sure to add this class to place item CSS and to this div here. And inside of this div, we'll soon add the map. For now, I'll just have a h2 tag where I say the map, which is of course not our final result. And with that, we're almost there. The missing piece now is that we connect the buttons down there. Now we can add an onClick listener, as I already did it here in the footer, because the custom button component in the end forwards the default onClick event to, well, the function that is received on an onClick prop. So we have to provide such an onClick prop to react to a click. And hence here on the view on map button, I'll add onClick and bind this to open map handler. So to that function which sets show map to true. Now if we save all files, it should recompile. And if I now click on view on map, you see that modal slide in and of course also slide out if I close it. However, it reloads the page if I close. So let's quickly go to the modal. Reason for that is that we have this form which gets submitted. And yeah, there on prevent default, of course I should execute this as a function, not just point at it. So I add the parentheses after prevent default. And now with that, if we go back, I can click close and it doesn't reload. Instead, it just removes the modal. And this also should look good on mobile. Yeah. Bit big there maybe. So maybe we should shrink our map container a little bit. Let's say 15 rem should do the trick. And with that, it looks good. But of course now the map itself is missing. We could of course also, by the way, fine-tune the position where the modal is shown, that it's shown further on top. That could be done in the modal CSS file. There, change top 30 VH maybe to 22 VH. VH is a CSS unit that is basically the viewport height. And this means 22% from the top of your viewport height. So now if we do that, yeah, I think that looks pretty decent. Yeah. So now let's focus on outputting a nice little map rendered through Google Maps here in this modal. To output Google Maps with React, or to render a Google Maps driven map in React, you'll find plenty of packages if you search for React Google Maps. And you could absolutely use one of these packages. I will not do that though, but instead build my own basic custom map to show you how that would work behind the scenes, because I think that's really interesting to see and to learn. Now for this, in the shared UI elements folder here, let's add a new map.js file and a map.css file next to it. Now in the map.js file, we build a regular React component, of course by importing React from React, and then here our map component which receives props, and then by exporting that map component, and then of course also import ./map.css. You can probably soon do that asleep. Now here, let's return a div. That div will be the host, so to say, for our map. And that div will receive a class name, which should be set dynamically. So I will, again, assign a default class of map, but then also offer the possibility of customizing this. You don't have to then use this possibility, but at least you could. I will also set style to props style so that you could also directly manipulate the inline styles, just adding some extra flexibility here, no matter if we use it or not. Now I want to render a map here with Google Maps, and for that we need the Google Maps SDK. So you can search for Google Maps JavaScript SDK and you'll find the official documentation. Now, first of all, we need to set up a project here and get an API key. We'll also later, by the way, in the Node.js module do the same, because there we'll need some other service from Google, and you can then later reuse the project you're about to set up here. To set up such a project, you need a Google account and click on Get Started. Now also, one important word here, for Google Maps and to use their tooling and their APIs and their SDKs, you need an account with a credit card. It's generally free to use, and you can search for Google Maps pricing to find their pricing information. You get $200 of free usage every month, which is a lot and which definitely suffices for what we're doing here in this course. But if you're using it in a real project, of course, you should definitely check which prices or which costs you can expect. And you also now need a credit card to continue and render a map. If you don't have one, of course, you could look into alternatives like Mapbox or simply render some dummy div with a background color here so that you can still continue with the course even if you're not seeing the map. Unfortunately, you need a credit card, not my rules, but Google's. Now here in this overlay, which you see on Google's page, check maps and also maybe places, because we'll need that later when we, in the Node.js module, also need a Google project and unlocked maps functionalities. Click continue thereafter, and now you have to select or create a project. There I will create a new project, which I'll name MERN. But you can pick any name you want here and click next. Now this will take a while and you'll have to confirm that this is the account you want to use for billing. As I mentioned, what we do in the course here will be possible for free, but definitely check the pricing if you're using it in a real project. Confirm this here. And after a while, the creation will be done. And you should see an overlay with your API key, which you will also need. If you're not seeing it, go to APIs and then click on Maps JavaScript API, Credentials. And this is the API key here, which you will soon need. Now, why do we need it? For that, search for Google Maps JS SDK again and go to their docs again, where we've been before. Here you'll learn how to render a map with Google Maps. And here you'll learn way more than what we will use in this course. So if you want to become a Google Maps expert and you want to use it in a lot of different ways in your next projects, these docs are the place to go. Now, one thing we need to do is we need to grab this script here and add this to our index.html file. There, let's say here at the bottom of body, but since it has async and defer on it, this doesn't really matter. So maybe also here in the head, we enter this script. And now here we need to inject our API key. So this API key I just mentioned, copy it, and then here replace your API key without the ampersand with your API key. But get rid of that callback init map thing here, so that you just have the script import ending with your API key. This will import the JavaScript package that helps you render Google Maps. With that, let's go back to our map.js file, because here we can now use this package which is added to our application. In there, in this component, we create a map with new window.google.maps.map. This is a constructor function which will now be available on the global window object in the end, thanks to this import we just added here. This SDK will be loaded and will add global variables on the window object, the Google variable to be precise, which then gives us access to the maps feature and there ultimately to the map constructor function. This now needs a pointer at an element, so in this case at this div, where the map should be rendered. Now to get this pointer in React world, we'll not use document getElementById and assign an ID to the div, even though that would also work, but we'll do it in a more elegant way. We can import useRef from React. This is another hook which we haven't used before. useRef can be used to create so-called references, which can be one of two things. We often use them to get a reference, a pointer at a real DOM node. That's one use case, a very prominent one. The other one is actually that with refs, we could also create variables which survive re-render cycles of our components and don't lose their value. But that's not what we need here. So all we do here is we create a mapref constant by calling useRef, const. And then on the div here, we add a special prop, the ref prop, which React understands, where we point at the mapref. And React does the rest and sets up a magic connection between this div and this constant, so that in this constant, we in the end store a pointer to this div. And now here, to this map constructor, we pass mapref, though not like this. Instead, there we have a current prop, which holds this actual pointer which we need. So now we tell Google Maps where it should render the map. Now the map constructor here takes a second argument, which is an object where we can configure that map. Specifically, we can set a center and a zoom level. Now I want to make sure that both can be set from outside. So here I want to be able to use props center and props zoom, so that this is really controlled from outside this component. And now it would also be nice to render a marker at the center. And by the way, you can learn all that syntax here in the official Google Maps docs, in case you're wondering how I know all of that. So here to render a marker, I simply call new window .google.maps.marker, and to marker you pass in an object which has a position key which should be props.center. And as a second argument, you pass in a map key which should point at your map object, which you created before. So here, this map constant. This will create a new marker in the center of our map. Now with that, we have everything in place which we need to render a map. So let's now go back to the place item and import map from shared components UI elements map, like this, and render it here instead of h2 the map. Instead, we render our map here as a self-closing component. And now on this map, we have to provide this center prop, which should be props coordinates, and the zoom prop, which I'll set to a level of 16, which should work quite well. Now important, this coordinates prop here, right? This has to have a specific format. You find that in the official docs of the JavaScript SDK, of course. It has to be an object with a let and a lng key where both values are numbers. Now that's exactly what we have in our coordinates prop here, because in place list, where I set the coordinates of a place item, I refer to place.location. And if we have a look at a place, there we do have a location property, which is exactly an object of that structure we need. If you created this in a different way, you definitely have to add some step to map it into the value Google Maps expects here. So into an object with a let and a lng key. And with that, let's save this and let's have a look. If I click view on map, this crashes. Now why is that? Well, this has something to do with some React internals. Let's have a look at the map component again. I rendered a map by using mapref current here, right? And that uses our reference, which I said is magically set up with the help of React here to this div. Now, what's the problem here? When this component renders for the first time, which will in the end happen when we render our place item, then this is executed from top to bottom. We initialize our ref, but the connection has not yet been established because this part hasn't executed yet. And this is where the connection is established. So we just initialize the ref, but there is no connection yet. And in the very next step, I tried to render a map in that place, but the connection wasn't established yet. So this can't work because Google Maps can't find out where to render this. Now, thankfully, React has got us covered. We can import another important hook, the useEffect hook. I haven't covered it thus far, but it's a super important hook and we'll see it a lot throughout this course. useEffect allows us to register logic, a function, that should be executed when certain inputs change. So for example, here, we set up useEffect, and we set up the function that should run, and then as a second argument to useEffect, an array of dependencies of that function. And whenever one of the dependencies changes, then the function here will be re-executed. If we specify no dependencies, this will only execute once when the component is initially mounted and loaded, and never thereafter. So, now we can move our map creation and marker logic into this function we have in useEffect here. Now, with it moved in there, we should also be clear that center and zoom in the end are dependencies here. So I will use object destructuring again to get these two properties out of props, center and zoom. I do this so that I can add them as dependencies independently here, and I don't have to add the entire props object as a dependency, which could change more often than just center and zoom. So here in there, we just refer to center and zoom, therefore, in all these places. And now we have a useEffect function, which will rerun whenever the center or the zoom value, which is passed in from outside, changes. And again, that's just object destructuring, a default JavaScript feature, which pulls elements out of props, or which pulls keys and their values out of props, so out of this props object, and stores them in new constants. Now, how does this help us? Well, useEffect will run when this component first is rendered, because then center and zoom changed. They had no value before, now they have a value. But, and that's the important thing about useEffect and why it helps us here, it will run after JSX has been processed and rendered. So it will run in the first render cycle, but after the JSX code has been rendered. And that means this connection here will have been established by the time this code runs. And we take advantage of this. If we now save this, this reloads, and if I now click on View on Map, this works. I'm not seeing the map, so something is still wrong, but generally it works. We get no error. So let's now make sure we also see the map though, because that of course should be the case. And the reason why we don't see the map is simply missing styles. In our map component, I have that map class here, right, on the div. Well, in map CSS, we should add some styles here for this map class selector, and we should set width to 100% and height to 100%. So that the map is rendered in the entire container we provide to it. And if we now save this, here, this already should work, otherwise reload, and now you should see that, and you got a Google map here, which you can scroll and move around and zoom in and out, and really use like your normal Google Maps functionality. You can even switch to satellite mode if you wish to. So now we're rendering this, if we click on View on Map, in our standalone modal. And with that, we already achieved a lot here. And we're still far from done. We're not able to add places, authenticate is not working, and so on. So there's still a lot of missing work or a lot of missing functionality, but we will get there. This is a great step forward. So, our application doesn't look too bad. We can certainly do some things here. Now, one thing we can't really do at the moment is add a new place. Now, one important note at this point, whilst we can of course add everything we need to add a new place, so the form inputs and so on, what we'll not build at this point of the course is a real functionality to add a new place to the list of places here, for the simple reason that we have no backend yet where we could store that new place. Now, we could absolutely use something like Redux to manage application-wide state in our front-end app here, and therefore manage our places locally in the browser. But this is not what we need later in the course. There, we don't want to manage all our data just locally in the browser. Instead, we want to manage it on a server to also share it with other users and not just have it on our machine, on our running instance of the React app. So therefore, I will add the add place functionality now, but will not wire it up to our list of places, because here in our code, of course, we only have a dummy list of places anyways, right? We have the dummy places here, and for now we'll not add any functionality to manage this application-wide, because as I mentioned, we'll do this on a server later. Nonetheless, let's work on the new place page here, and let's make sure that we actually can add a new place so that we do have all the inputs for that, and that we can at least get to the point where we would be ready to send the place off to a server. For that, we need to build a form in new place. I want to return a form here instead of a h2 tag. And on that form, I'll add a class name of place-form. You can, of course, use any class you want. And in there, I want to have a couple of inputs and also a submit button in the end. Now, for the inputs, we could, of course, use the regular HTML inputs and combine that with, let's say, label components. But I want to create my own component, which combines both and that's important, which also has built-in user input validation. My idea is that we have some kind of input component, which we could use like this. And that on this input component, we can configure it. We can give it a type of text, for example. We can give it a label of title. And we can also add a validators property, which should take an array of predefined validation rules, which we'll also have to create. So quite a complex component, which does not just render some visuals to the screen, but which, as I just said, also has some built-in logic for validating user input and so on. So that by the end, when this component is finished, we have an onChange prop there, which triggers a function on every keystroke and gives us not just the input, not just the text the user entered, but also some information whether that input is valid, so that we have the validation built into the inputs and we don't have to do it here in this new place component. That's again this idea of splitting code and of outsourcing things. So, step by step, let's first of all build a simple input which just outputs something visually, and then later, as a next step, let's add the validation. As a last step, we'll then also add validation to the entire form, where I basically want to sum up the different validation results of the individual inputs and decide whether the overall form is valid or not. But that will be the last step. So let's go to form elements then, and in there, let's add a new input.js file and an input.css file to add, well, this component I was just talking about. And as I said, this will be a complex component, so we'll spend some time on it. We start simple though. We import React from React here, and then we have our input component, which receives some props and which will have some logic in there, and we export this. And of course, we should also import the CSS styling here, so /input CSS. Also, a little side note at this point, there are third-party libraries like Formic, which you can use in React to get form functionality for free, so to say. So to simply install that library, and then you can set up forms and form inputs with it, and use that to handle validations on. You could absolutely do that, and you can look into solutions like that. But in my courses, I'm always a big fan of teaching the topic at hand in depth. And I find it very interesting to see how form validation could be set up on your own and how you could build quite a sophisticated form input system without any third-party library. And therefore, that is what we'll do here. Back to our input component though. Here, I now want to return some JSX. And the JSX we do return here will be a div, which groups together a label and an input. And on that div, I want to assign some dynamic class names, form control, which will always be there. But in addition, I also want to be able to later add some dynamic class, so a class which will not always be added based on the validity of the input, so that we can, for example, color the label and the input field red if it's invalid. For now, we'll just have form control there, but we'll add more later. Inside of the div, we now need a label element, and there I want to output the text which is received on the label prop of our custom component. And there I'll also add HTML4 props ID. This here is basically the for attribute you have on a normal label as well. Just as the class attribute, for is a keyword in JavaScript. So here in JSX we can't use it, and hence we have HTML4, which will be translated to that regular for attribute once this is rendered to the DOM. Well, and then I expect to get some ID via props, and I pass this to HTML4. Then here I want to render the actual input. And there I want to be flexible. This input component should be able to render a regular input, but also a text area. So to cater for both, I will take a step back here and create an element, let's say, element constant, and the content of that depends on, let's say, an element prop, where we can decide from outside which kind of element we want to render. And if the element prop holds a value of input, then element, so this element constant here, will store an input element. Otherwise, it will store a text area, like this. Now, of course, we need to configure both now. The input here will receive some props, the ID, for example, props ID, and also the type, props.type, so that we can decide from outside which type of input we create, text, number, and so on. We also might want to be able to set a placeholder text with props placeholder. And that's it for now. We'll add more later, but for the moment, that is it. On the text area, we also can set the ID of this element. And we also might want to be able to set the rows from outside. So we can set this to props rows or to a default of 3, let's say, with this fallback value in case the rows prop is not defined. Now for the moment, that's it. Below the label, we can now output the element. So here, a dynamic expression, because I'm referring to a JavaScript expression here. I'm outputting the value of element after all, and the value of element is either input or text area. So that's getting rendered down there. With that, we have a very simple input or a form control set up. Now it's also time for some styling, and for that, attached you find an input CSS file, where you can just paste the content into this input CSS file. And you will also find a new place CSS file, where you can paste your content in, and make sure that in new place.js you import that new place CSS file, of course. And this will ensure that the entire form is styled properly. Now in new place.js we can also import the input component now. So import input from, and then let's go to the shared folder, components, form elements, input, and this should therefore work. Now let's see if it works, and for that we'll need to specify one extra thing here. Keep in mind that in our newly added input component, we require the element prop to render either an input or a text area. So if we don't specify it, we'll always render a text area, but if we don't want a text area, we have to add an element prop and set this value to input. So here in the new place component, I will add element and set this to input here. With that, if we save this, we get this simple form. Not super amazing, but a good starting point. Of course, at the moment, there is no built-in validation or anything like that. So before we add more and more inputs, let's actually focus on that built-in logic and validation part.